I struggled to know what to title this presentation, but we'll go with this: God gives you what you want. I'm excited to cover these topics. I hope that they make sense. I hope it's not too broad of a collection of thoughts to share, but this is what it's time to teach, so let's get into it. Let's start with motive. I'm going to drop some truth bombs on you, and I hope that you take notes or make mental notes at least of some of these ideas and come back to it and think about it. By applying these things to your life and thinking through examples and situations in your life, I think you'll get a lot more out of this. You'll get a lot more mileage. Most people in this world, they're motivated by feeling good. That's it. And you can connect all sorts of details to that general idea. But what's a much better motivation is to actually be good. Now, what good means, I go into some detail in other things that I've taught. In particular, I'm thinking of the book, The Glory of God is Intelligence. I talk about good and evil a lot in that book. But good is God. God is good. He's the definition of what is good. And the more we get to know God, the better an idea we have of what good actually means. So if you're committed to being good, you're committed to positive change. You're committed to constant improvement because you have to acknowledge that you're much less than what God is, but also that because of who he is and what he's done, there is a pathway for you to become more like him. And that's what it means to be good, is to grow closer to how God is. So that's a progressive idea, and that's not the point of this presentation, but I'm just trying to give a little bit of context here. Feeling good, on the other hand, it's not about reality. It's about perception. So God is the absolute reality, and everything that he understands about reality is what we should aim to understand. And we should seek to acquire his thoughts and ideas and his vision of what reality is. But instead of that, what most people do is they concern themselves with how they perceive reality. And you can construct any sort of vain imagination that you would like about how things are. And that is an effective way to feel good. But feeling good is not the same as being good. Now, that's not to say that you won't feel good by being good. In fact, you'll feel the best that you can, given reality, if you try to be good, if you actually become good. But feeling good is an illusion, and it's a very constrained situation where so much of what you identify with who you are and how life is intricately tied to your perception of how reality works. And when life comes along and slaps you around, it rips that out from you. And that's one of the most painful things you can experience. So it doesn't matter how good you feel. What matters is how closely are your perceptions tied to how things really are. And the closer they're tied to reality, the more robust you will be, and the more permanent your happiness will be, because it won't be subject to change based on the revelation of things differently than how you suppose them to be. I don't know if that makes sense, but we'll move on here. If you want to understand people, you have to understand their motive. And their motive, in almost every case, is to feel good. It's not to be good, it's to feel good. So most people, what they'll do, what they'll think, and what they'll believe is what makes them feel good about who they are right now. Not who they could be, not who they should be, but who they are. The natural man is an enemy to God, and our default state as human beings is to be something very much less than what we could be, and very much less than what would give us the greatest degree of happiness. So this sets up a contradictory state. People will act in a way that makes them feel good, but unfortunately, by acting in that way, they guarantee that they won't actually be happy because they aren't actually good, and only by being actually good can you encounter the greatest amount of happiness. What happens is when someone has a belief system that is contradicted by reality, they will bend over backwards to avoid every manifestation of their incorrectness. And so they will navigate their lives in such a way as to avoid any signal that what they've chosen to believe is wrong or incomplete, incorrect or incomplete. And any people in their lives that might represent that idea as well, they will avoid. And if they have to interact with them, they will hate them. This is just human nature. And so it's good to understand these things, both to inform how you interact with others, and also to see these things in yourself when you're off track, which again is the default position. So there are some, very few, but there are some people whose motive is to be good. And for those, their objective, they'd like to improve their understanding of what is good, and they know that that will require them to change because they want to change to be more like what is good. And so that's the dichotomy. First choice, you want to feel good about who you are. Second choice, you want to learn more about what it means to be good because you want to change to be more like that. You can sort everyone in this dichotomy. And what you'll find is deep down inside, almost no one wants to be good. That's unfortunate, but that's just the way it is. You should ask yourself if you want to be good. It's one of my favorite passages from Scripture. This is in John chapter 3. Verse 19 says, "And this is the condemnation, that light has come into the world, and men loved darkness rather than light, because their deeds were evil. For everyone that doeth evil hateth the light, neither cometh to the light, lest his deeds should be reproved. But he that doeth truth cometh to the light, that his deeds may be made manifest, that they are wrought in God." This right here explains everything that you see in the world in terms of human behavior. When light is manifested, you can see how people react. And most people, like cockroaches, they'll turn from the light and run away as fast as they can. Some people will turn into the light and they'll run towards the light as fast as they can. Knowing, because all men and women, all mankind knows that the light will manifest what you lack. It will tear apart your illusions, and it will painfully expose the things that you don't yet understand, the things about you that aren't good. That is not variable. Everyone knows that deep down inside. The question is whether they admit it or not. The question is, how do you react to that? And for most people, they'll run away from it as fast as they can. Some people will turn into it and run into it as fast as they can. But good luck finding people like that. I'm going to transition into talking about humility. Humility is not minimizing the truth of what you have. Some people, well-meaning people, teach that humility means to minimize the truth of what you have. And they'll say, oh, it doesn't matter if you've got $1 million. You shouldn't talk about the fact that you have $1 million. Well, there are appropriate times to talk about that. Some people will say, oh, it doesn't matter if you hold the world record for heaviest squat. You shouldn't talk about that. Well, there are appropriate times to talk about that. I've talked about this before. Those are two silly examples, right? But it goes with anything. Let's say there's a woman who's one of the most beautiful women on earth. Why shouldn't she recognize that if it's truthful? This is a deep topic. I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I will mention this point again, and I've brought it up before. There comes a time where if you don't recognize the truth of what you have, and you happen to have a lot of something, you will do far less than you would if you did recognize that truth. So we were talking about money. Let's just focus on that for a second. If you are wealthy and you don't recognize that you're wealthy, are you going to give as much money to others as you would if you realized that you were wealthy? If you just feel like everybody else, then you're not going to feel any sense of responsibility to do more than everyone else does. And if it's the case that you have more than everyone else, or more than most, and you do just what most people do, then you'll be held accountable for the good that you could have done but didn't. So it is very important to understand the truth of what you have. If Jesus acted like he was just a normal person, we'd all be in a lot of trouble. And the same is true to a lesser degree for all of us. Everyone has a gift given them from God, and if you don't accurately identify what those gifts are, whether it's an actualized potential or just potential waiting to be actualized, if you don't recognize what those gifts are, you're going to have to contend with a great deal of sorrow after this life when a much greater share of reality is dispensed to you. And you realize, and you can't get away from the fact that you could have done so much more than you did. So humility is not minimizing the truth of what you have. What is humility? It's a correct realization of the magnitude of what you don't yet have. So you don't squish down what you have. What you do is you acquire a realistic understanding of what you don't have. And the funny thing about this false definition of humility, of minimizing the truth of what you have, is if you think about what you will do as a result of it, as a result of that perspective, if you're squishing down the truth of what you have and diminishing your recognition of that, your actions will be very different. So I mentioned this a little with the money thing, but let's flip this over and think about it from the perspective of true humility. It doesn't matter if you're the world's strongest man and you can squat 2,000 pounds or something crazy. That doesn't minimize what you don't have yet. There's still this whole world of things that you can work on and you can progress in. But if you just minimize the truth of what you have and you say like, oh yeah, well, I mean, I lift weights and, whatever. It doesn't highlight those things that you have to work on. And that's sort of the point of all of this. So when you correctly recognize the truth in terms of what you have to offer, you will do more than if you don't. And when you correctly identify what you don't yet have, you'll do more to work on those things. I hope that makes sense. So using these definitions, here's an example of a prideful attitude. Now, I'm going to give you two quotes here. No one's actually going to say these things, of course. But you can sort of put your translator on, and when people act in a certain way or say certain things, this is what they really mean deep down inside. This is the belief that they're operating under. So prideful attitude says, I assume that I know everything there is to know. Therefore, anything new will be treated as an inferior position to the one I hold until proven otherwise. So these kinds of people that are not humble, they're prideful, they assume that what they know is everything there is to know. And because of that attitude, any time new truth is presented to them, now that could be explicitly through another person who says, hey, I want to tell you about this thing. Or it could be through life, because they're presented with some challenge that they don't have the tools to handle, or some situation where if they were open-minded, they would actually learn something from it. So when they're presented with these opportunities for new truth, the way they will react is, hey, I already know everything there is to know, so you better hit me with something that proves that I'm wrong, because otherwise why would I even listen to you? Again, this is the default position of everyone on this planet. I'm not saying everyone is like this. I'm saying that we should operate from the assumption that everyone is like this, because you will be right far more often than you're wrong. A humble attitude, on the other hand, is something like this. I assume everything I know is incomplete or incorrect. Therefore, anything new will be treated as an improvement until proven otherwise. These people are open-minded, they're humble, they're open to new truth, and like a child, they explore the world as a limitless opportunity to learn more. Everything they experience, every person they meet, it's all presumed to be an opportunity to learn and improve until proven otherwise. So they test everything, and they have an open mind, and they just learn massive amounts compared to the prideful. Now, I've spoken about the need to have a filter, the need to be able to discern, and I'm not going to go into that here, but that is something that you should think about. Every strength has an equal and opposite weakness that comes with it, and that has to be overcome to enjoy the full value of the strength. And open-mindedness is no different than any other positive attribute. The negative side of that is being naive and getting suckered into things that hurt you, or at least keep you busy and keep you occupied from acquiring better things. Okay, so continuing on with this question of humility, the more you think you have, the less you will get. This is a true axiom. So again, this is something you can ponder and think about if you're doing this in your life. Remember, true humility is a correct understanding of what you don't have. So one way to measure this is to see how you react to stimulus. So for example, I think that should actually be stimuli, plural. A lot of people will react to putative new truth by asking themselves, again implicitly, I seriously doubt anyone does this explicitly, but because they would know how foolish it is, they say, is this going to make me feel good about who I am and what I believe? Because again, they assume that they already know everything they need to know. When you're having a conversation, you'll see this in people, right? Someone will suggest a way to improve, or a way that they perceived the actions of this person, or whatever. Maybe highlight some limitations to their thinking. And that person, you can see the gears cranking, and how they react, you can predict it based on how it's going to make them feel. So if they're hearing something they don't want to hear, and the wicked take the truth to be hard, what they'll do is they'll spin up any sort of response that minimizes the negative feelings they might have. So they might shift the blame onto someone or something else, or they might try to get that person angry so then it's not their fault anymore, or they might go to this this good thing that they did to try to justify or balance out the bad thing. You know, the possibilities are endless, but this is the root cause. They're trying to get themselves to the point where they feel good without actually being good. So suppose what you're offering them is actually truth, it's an improvement over whatever they have. The last thing they're going to do is say, oh yeah, okay, and change, because that would be an admission that they are not, in fact, perfect. And the last thing these kinds of people are going to do is admit that. Instead, they're going to try to shortcut this somehow into I'm already good, and I'm going to feel good about how I am right now, instead of changing into something that's better than I am right now. So humble people, on the other hand, what they're asking themselves is this going to help me improve my understanding of what is good and what to believe? In other words, they're totally okay with the idea that what's being presented to them is better than what they have. They're totally okay with the idea of shifting their beliefs, growing them to something better. because their underlying assumption is that everything they know is incorrect or incomplete. So they're actively looking for something better. They're saying, like, look, right now these are the tools that I have in my toolbox, and I'm not married to these tools. I anticipate trading up for something better in every case. So my question is, which of these two attitudes do you think will yield the most growth and happiness? I hope the answer is ridiculously obvious. Any attitude that leads to greater truth is going to yield greater growth and happiness than any attitude that does not. But this is the lie. This is the lie that is sold to us, that somehow there is another way, that somehow we can be happy without living after the manner of happiness, that somehow we can cheat reality and get something for nothing. And that's just not true. So if you're going to recognize every opportunity that's presented to you to improve, you have to adopt this attitude. You have to deeply believe that no matter what you presently have, there's something radically better that you're not aware of. So this is the tools in the toolbox trading up idea. But I want you to pay attention to the two words I used intentionally here, deeply and radically. You can't just believe that maybe something out there might be a little better than what you have. You have to deeply believe that no matter what you have, there's something radically better. And the reason you have to deeply believe, and the reason it has to be radically better, is that the path to obtain these things is not going to be short, it's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be pleasant. Okay, let's transition to desire. In this life, we get what we desire. There should be a scripture quote here from Alma chapter... Oh, I can't remember. Sorry. But I need to make some points about this. And maybe that scripture's on another slide. What we desire is distinct, usually, from what we wish for. So you can say that you want anything. It doesn't mean that you actually want it. And that might seem cryptic, but we're sort of exposing limitations of colloquial English here. You could say, I want $1 million. But if someone says, okay, well, here's 30 years. You need to work like a maniac and save tons of money and invest very wisely and take these risks and get lucky. And at the end of that, you'll have $1 million. How many people are going to say, yeah, I'll do that? Well, guess what? You have that opportunity. Are you doing it? Probably not. But if someone says, do you want $1 million? You'd say, oh, yeah, I want $1 million. So what you desire, at least in the way I'm using these words right now, what you desire is what you really want. In other words, what you're willing to pay the price of to get. But you can wish for any old thing you want. It doesn't mean you're willing to do what's required to get it. So for the most part, people are unwilling to do what it takes to get what they say they want. So when we say that God gives us what we desire, we do not mean that he's some genie and you rub the lamp and you say your wish and you get the thing. God is subject to his own law. Whether it's by choice or whether he's constrained by a reality that exists external to him is irrelevant for our purposes here. But the point is that the rules of the game are fixed, and we don't get to change those. We can choose to interact with them to a greater or lesser degree, but we can't break them. So if you want to fulfill your desires, there is only one way to do that, and that is by playing the game according to the rules that were set before we got here. So that requires that you let go of what you wish you could do or have, or what you wish you were, and instead move towards a greater share of reality, a more accurate estimate of reality, and what you really want. Now, I don't care what you wish for in life, or even what you really want in life, but we ought to be brutally honest about what it is that we wish for, what it is that we really want, because otherwise we are guaranteed to end up in a different place than where we want to be. And persisting an illusion, or a delusion, as it might be more accurately phrased, of what it is that we want will always increase suffering beyond what's necessary. Okay, it's picture time. So let's suppose that this star is your desire. And again, if you're listening to this, this is probably a part that you want to see rather than listen to. So this arrow is what you think the path is, and this person is you. So one point to make here is, so often, especially Christians, they get tied up with this idea that our desires are evil. And again, that is true if you define desire a certain way. But it's only true in terms of the means that we assume will lead to the end that we desire. And I'll get into this more, but I think that you will find, if you analyze what it is you actually desire, instead of focusing on what you assume the path is to get there, the desire's good. It's the path that's not. So a whole big chunk of the gospel is actually about revealing the reality of the means we assume are required to fulfill the desires that we have. And that disconnect in the path is really where the problem lies. It's not so much in what you desire. I mean, can you imagine, do you know anyone that you could ask them, hey, do you want to be happy? And they'd say, no, I don't really. I'm just not interested. So maybe that's a simplistic example, but if you go down the list of what people desire, the desire itself is probably good. It's the path that's wrong. It's incomplete or it's incorrect. And here's the issue. When we pray or when we live, the decisions we make, the belief systems we adopt, the feelings we feel, it's all fixed on what we think this path is. And when we pray, what do? Do we ask for the fulfillment of the desire? No, we ask for help on the path. We ask that the path that we've imagined be fulfilled. And that's really where the problem lies. Why? Well, God knows what the actual path is. And he knows that it's not this simple walk through the woods. Actually, there are man-eating sharks at the beginning, and then there are these mountains we have to climb in the middle, and then in the end, there's this giant gorilla that we have to defeat before we can actually get to this thing that we desire, this outcome that we desire. And maybe the obstacles are different in every case, but it's something like this in every case. And actually, the better the desire, the harder, the more difficult the path is to get to it. Now, remember that there's an incredible difference between God's awareness and our awareness. And so what looks to be right around the corner for us and a walk in the park, God knows that that's not the case. He knows that it's actually much more difficult to get to that outcome than we think. Now, I'm going to give you a little secret here, so get ready. Our awareness is sort of perpetually limited. We hope that we'll grow in awareness, but that doesn't mean that it's still not going to be massively less than what God has. So the question is, how can you posture yourself to overcome all these obstacles without actually knowing ahead of time what they're going to be? Jesus gives this parable in the New Testament of a king going out to war, and he says, well, who's going to do that without sitting down and counting the cost before you do it? The details of what the gospel costs are unknown to us because we have limited awareness. But in a general sense, we're told what it's going to cost. It's going to cost everything we have to give. But we can't really comprehend what that means until we make that level of a sacrifice. So in the meantime, how do you posture yourself to overcome these things? The absolute only way is to trust in God. You have to get to know his character, and then you can lean on that and use it as a bridge to overcome these things that you're not presently aware of and that lie outside of your comprehension and your understanding. And that is a key. So I hope that's a principle that you can learn and apply in your life. So let's see. That's okay. As far as desires go and asking for things, in Luke 11 we read, I say unto you, ask, and it shall be given you. Seek, and ye shall find. Knock, and it shall be opened unto you. For every one that asketh receiveth, and he that seeketh findeth, and to him that knocketh it shall be opened. If a son shall ask bread of any of you that is a father, will he give him a stone? Or if he ask a fish, will he for a fish give him a serpent? Or if he shall ask an egg, will he offer him a scorpion? If ye then, being evil, know how to give good gifts unto your children, how much more shall your heavenly Father give the Holy Spirit to them that ask him? And the point here is that the problem's not the desire. The problem is the way you go about getting it. Okay? So if you ask him for an egg, he's not going to give you a scorpion. If you ask him for a loaf of bread, he's not going to give you a snake or a rock or, you want fish, you want bread. He's not going to give you these other things. That's not where the difference lies. The difference lies in the path. So if you find yourself saying, yeah, but I'm asking God for an egg and he's giving me a scorpion. No, he's not. You're focused on the path, not the outcome. Shift your focus to the outcome. I'll go into some detail about that in a minute. But this is how it turns out to be. God, knowing all things from the beginning, knows that you're about to face this shark. So before you get there, he's going to detour you to learn how to swim better. And once you have like Michael Phelps superpowers, you can outswim that shark, and then you move on to the next thing. And he knows that you're going to have to climb this mountain. So he's going to train you to be stronger. And then you'll maybe avoid that obstacle, or you'll overcome it directly more often than not. And then you'll be prepared to face this gorilla because you'll be much stronger, etc. So this path contains things that you don't see, and it will require you to be strong in ways you don't yet realize you're weak. It'll also tend to be way longer than you anticipate. But none of that means that the desire is bad, and none of that means that the desire isn't worth it. How much you detour, how much you're willing to detour, and how long you're willing to take to obtain your desire will dictate how many of these desires and how good of desires God can fulfill. The limit is not from God. God wants you to possess all things that he has. We are the ones that limit that, not him. And the way we limit that is we quit. We suffer from unbelief. We limit what we believe is possible, and we limit what we're willing to go through. And all of that stems from a fundamental distrust of God. If we really believed him, and we really believed how he is, we would not limit him in any way, and we wouldn't quit, and we would just keep at it. In this life, God will subject you to the greatest portion, the greatest quantity of what you require to fulfill all these desires. And he'll keep doing it until you quit. I believe fundamentally that there has yet to be a person who's taken out of the game before they quit. Maybe there's some fine print to that I'm not aware of yet. But he will dump this onto you. in the greatest quantity you're willing to receive. This is partially what it means to have the windows of heaven open, to pour this stuff out on you to the degree that it overflows and more doesn't fit in your life. You're the one who determines what your capacity is, and he stands ready to send all of this to you. Okay, so why does he stop short? Well, it's because of our reaction, because in almost every case, what will happen is we'll either say, stop, I'm good, or we'll be so oblivious to this process that we're sitting here on a hamster wheel getting hit by the same exact obstacle over and over and over and over again. Now, what this obstacle is, the specifics can vary widely from person to person, situation to situation, but once you see this pattern, you can get to know someone and see this so clearly, and you're like, oh my gosh, don't you realize that all this grief in your life, like it comes from this one thing, this one principle you're lacking, or this one thing that you're afraid of, or whatever, and all you have to do is trust God and overcome that one thing, and then you're on this path that's way better than where you are right now. And you'll be filled with sorrow if you gain this wisdom, because you'll look around and you'll see people that live their whole lives getting beat down by this one thing, or they live their whole lives not really growing at all, or getting any closer to their magnificent potential as a child of God, because they don't trust God, and they never learn. They never learn these things that he's trying to teach them, and it's so obvious. It's so obvious. All right, let's hit some scriptures. So here's one that supports this idea that God has a path, and that the only way to achieve your desires is through walking that path. In D&C 104:16, he says, "It must needs be done in mine own way. And behold, this is the way that I, the Lord, have decreed." And this occurs in a specific situation, but that's irrelevant. The general principle holds in any situation. God has his own way. And if you want the effect, you have to follow the cause. In Isaiah 55:8, he reminds us that his thoughts are not our thoughts, and his ways are not our ways. His ways are higher than our ways. And if we're wise, we'll seek to better understand his ways instead of obsessing about our own. In Proverbs 3, we read, "Trust in the Lord with all thine heart, and lean not unto thine own understanding. In all thy ways acknowledge him, and he shall direct thy paths. Be not wise in thine own eyes, fear the Lord, and depart from evil." In Jacob 4:10, we're told, "Seek not to counsel the Lord, but to take counsel from his hand." Why? Because we know that he counseleth in wisdom and in justice and in great mercy over all his works. If you really believe in God, you should have absolutely no hesitation in seeking him on all matters and not assuming that you have any idea what you're talking about. In Alma 29:4-5, this is the one I promised to show you before. He says, "I ought not to harrow up in my desires the firm decree of a just God, for I know that he granteth unto men according to their desire, whether it be unto death or unto life. Yea, I know that he allotteth unto men, yea, decreeth unto them decrees which are unalterable, according to their wills, whether they be unto salvation or unto destruction." And finally, in Isaiah 55:2, it says, "Wherefore do you spend money for that which is not bread, and your labor for that which satisfieth not? Hearken diligently unto me, and eat ye that which is good, and let your soul delight itself in fatness." I want to go back to this picture to make a note here. When we try to take the off-ramp from God's ordained path for us, we think that we're escaping. But really all we're doing is releasing the pressure from the pressure cooker. And what we're going to encounter by doing that is far more suffering without the attached joy and happiness than we would encounter on the path. It's not only that this is the only way, but it's also the best way. God does not direct us in paths that aren't the most beneficial for us. And so when we deviate from that, or we call it quits, we're always choosing something that's inferior. Every time we will be worse off. And that's the dirty secret that they don't tell you up front. But I'm telling you so that you know. If you deviate from God's will for you, it will always be a lesser path, and it won't be fun. There's more I could say about that. I'll just say one thing briefly. So remember that Satan's tactic is to minimize negative consequences and overemphasize positive consequences. And a lot of times when we take the off-ramp from God's ordained path, it's because we don't realize yet, we're not aware of all of the negative consequences or the scope of them, because we assume that what is unseen doesn't exist. But I promise you that you are going to get hit by things that you're not expecting, and if you knew about them ahead of time, you would absolutely stay on the path and keep your trust in God and go to where He wants you to go. He sees the end from the beginning. We don't, unless He's showed it to us. And so we need to be really careful about those calculations because we have a lot of missing variables. All right, so I made the claim that our desires are typically good. It's the means that aren't. And again, I'm using my own definitions of these words. I'm aware that the natural man's desires are evil continually, etc. But when you separate the means from the end, then you can recognize that the properties change on those specific terms. Okay, so let's talk about some examples. So if someone says, hey, I want a lot of money, do they actually want a lot of money? Or do they want to be able to buy the things that a lot of money buys? Or really fundamentally, do they just want security? So if security is the desire, money's just a means. And if you make your goal the money, you're probably going to be on a path that's not ideal from God's perspective. But if you want security, then He does have a path to give you greater security than anything else in life can give you. So if you look at the lives of the righteous, many times we have many examples of these ending in gruesome, brutal ways. Stephen was stoned, Isaiah was sawed in half from the bottom up, and so on. Jesus died on the cross, and yet these people had more security than anyone does. So there's a path there, right? I'm probably not selling this well if I'm saying, yeah, get sawn in half. It's great. Anyway, let's just keep going. What about love? So people do a lot of things in the quote-unquote name of love. But what are they really after? If you sit down and you define what they're actually desiring here, there's probably a path that's very different than what they're pursuing to get there. And the desire itself is good. It's a good desire to want to love and be loved. But we mess up in our idea of what that path is, because when you have the awareness that God does, it's going to look a lot different than it does from our perspective. And then what about happiness? I did this experiment once where I asked this group of younger people, I asked them what they wanted out of life. And most of them said, well, I want to be happy. And I made them write an essay about it. This was in one of my classes. And it was really interesting because I said, don't say I want to be happy. Define what you mean when you say happiness. And some people said they don't want to have to worry about money. Other people said they want to spend time with family, and so on. But everyone has a specific definition of what this means. But almost always what they use to define it is things and people. In other words, they define it with external things that they can't really control at the end of the day. If your happiness is defined by external things, you will never have unshakable happiness, because all of those things will always let you down. And there will always be cases where they don't apply. They don't either they don't exist, or there's a lapse, or something happens, or whatever it is. So it's really important to separate the ends and the means. And the ends can be good, and we don't necessarily have to negotiate on those. But the means, we have to absolutely trust God. You should trust God on everything, but what I'm trying to say is those desires are probably from Him. They're probably programmed in you as part of your being a child of God. And the problem isn't the end, it's the means. And you should turn that over to God and seek His awareness, and He will show you a better way to obtain the end. And not only a better way, the only way. So let's pivot here, and we're going to talk about this same idea of means and ends, but we're going to apply it to you personally. So not so much about what you want out of life, but in terms of who you are. There's this phrase in Scripture, seeing as you are seen. It pops up a couple times. Let's see, 1 John chapter 3, there's a little bit about it. There's some of this, I think, 2 Corinthians. But here's a quote from D&C 7694. It says, "They who dwell in His presence, in God's presence, are the church of the firstborn, and they see as they are seen, and know as they are known, having received His fullness and of His grace." As you're reading through the Scriptures, and you hit these little phrases, it pays dividends to dig in and ask God, what do you mean when you say this? Because He doesn't just throw words around. When you see something, it means something, and you should figure out why He uses the words He uses. So in this case, this phrase, see as they are seen, it's pregnant with meaning and value. So a starting point here is to realize, if you believe that God has an exceedingly great awareness compared to you, you should also admit that that awareness does not only apply to external things, but also internally to who you really are deep down inside. And the fact is that you do not see yourself as God sees you. Does that make sense? So if you're looking at the world with really messed up vision, and you need like Coke bottle glasses, and you're taking off your glasses and you're looking around, and then you put your glasses on, things are going to look very, very different. And essentially, we have very messed up vision, and God has perfect vision. And so He sees us very differently than we see ourselves. He sees things as they really are. And this isn't just a character judgment, it's a context judgment. So we tend to see ourselves in a vacuum, and God sees us in context of everything else in reality. So I'll give you an example of this. It can go both ways, right? So David was the youngest child in a family, and he was mostly disregarded in terms of value. But when God's prophet came to David's parents to find him and anoint him as king, and the parents presented all the kids all the sons from oldest to youngest, the prophet said, none of these are the guy. Do you have another son? And the parents are like, oh yeah, there's David. He's out with the sheep. And the guy says, well, come, bring him here, because I've got some work to do. God judged David's heart. He didn't judge the outside. And what that means is not just where David was at the moment, but the seed of his character within him, his divine potential, was greater than his brothers, even though it hadn't manifested yet. And this, if you're a book writer, or a novel writer, I should say, or a movie maker, this is a theme that can get played out over and over again. We love movies about this and books about this hero that doesn't know that he's a hero yet, or heroine that doesn't know she's a heroine yet. And this is a real thing. So God can see in you a potential that you do not see. Now this is a sidetrack, but we misinterpret stories in the Scriptures very frequently in terms of people like Gideon, who were chosen by God, and maybe even David. But we have this false paradigm where God chooses some arbitrary person and he waves his magic wand over this person, and then this person turns into a great person. That is not the way it works. So there's nothing magic about the gospel. And the principles that apply in this case are that when God calls someone to do something, that is the next logical step of their progression. As we read, for example, in Alma 13, just because our awareness of someone's progression is jagged, doesn't mean that it's not completely continuous if we were to be aware of all things. So we see someone like Gideon, and it seems like out of nowhere God calls him to come and defeat the Midianites and be this great hero for Israel. That didn't come out of nowhere. In God's awareness of all things, Gideon was completely prepared for that next step. It was the next logical progression from where he was. But to those around him, he was just Gideon. There was nothing special about him. Same thing with David. And it's only after they do what they're meant to do that you can look back and say, oh yeah, I can see how this person was actually way different than everyone thought. We just didn't have the context to see those attributes manifested yet. If you look at what David did or what Abraham did or any of these people, Jesus is obviously the prime example. His siblings and the people in his hometown rejected him, at least initially, in the case of his siblings, because they said, hey, we know this guy and there's nothing special about him. And it wasn't until he had the context to manifest the differences within him that he was seen as anything different. Anyway, that's a sidetrack. It can go the other way as well, where, and this unfortunately is much, much more likely, you are probably way more wicked than you know. But if you trust God and you subject yourself to him and you pay attention to everything he's showing you in your life and everything he's causing you to experience in your life, he will manifest to you how you really are. And so for some of us, we'll realize that we are endowed with certain qualities that we were not aware of that are positive. But much more often, he'll reveal to us things that aren't so hot. And these are opportunities for us to grow. Now, Revelation 3, 17 through 19, it says, because thou sayest, this is the Lord rebuking a group of people, but it's actually very applicable in a general sense. He says, because thou sayest, I am rich and increased with goods and have need of nothing, and knowest not that thou art wretched and miserable and poor and blind and naked, I counsel thee to buy of me gold tried in the fire, that thou mayest be rich, and white raiment, that thou mayest be clothed, and that the shame of thy nakedness do not appear, and anoint thine eyes with eye salve, that thou mayest see. As many as I love, I rebuke and chasten. Be zealous therefore and repent. Now I hope, this is from Revelation 3, it's the Lord speaking. I hope you remember from John chapter 3, these are parallel passages. What happens when the light shines? Most of us run away into the cracks where it's still dark, like cockroaches. If you turn to God with all of your heart, might, mind, and strength, he's going to shine that light right into the deepest corners of your heart. And you're going to find out that while you might think that you're rich and have need of nothing, he's going to show you that you're wretched, you're miserable. That's important, right? You might think you're happy because, you go backpacking in Europe and have all this fun doing this or that, and you have this fancy house or this nice car or this trophy spouse or these kids that are really good at soccer or whatever. But he's going to tear all of that from you or show you that in the end, none of it matters and that you're actually miserable with respect to reality. And the reason he's doing this, of course, isn't to arbitrarily punish you or to make you suffer more than is helpful. It's to show you that in reality, this is actually how it is. I don't want to deviate to say this, but I'm supposed to. So The fact is that we look at these gut-wrenching events when we're super sad, or when we're suffering a whole ton, or this really unexpected thing happens. We see these as glitches in the matrix. We see these as random, unfortunate events that there's nothing you can do to prepare for, and they just kind of happen, and it's not life. It's just this thing that happens sometimes in life. That is completely wrong. So God has all things before him continually. And one way to think about this, it's very hard to describe these ideas, but one way to think about this is that how you feel when this super unfortunate rare thing happens to you or someone you love. Imagine a situation where it's like that all the time. Now, the reason those things are so hard to deal with is because your belief system is inadequate to support that. And I don't mean belief system in the narrow sense of like a prescribed religion or something. I mean how you actually interact with life. If you had stronger principles, so when these things happen to you, it zaps all of your happiness and you just want to die, But it might be impossible to imagine, but try to imagine a situation where you have principles that are strong enough that you can have the maximal level of happiness possible to have in this life while also going through things like that. That might sound absolutely nuts, but it shouldn't. It's actually the exact objective of the gospel of Jesus Christ for that to happen, because God has every negative thing before him continually, and yet he's happier than any of us are. He has more joy. And that's the mystery of godliness, and that's something that you have to figure out. And the point of the gospel is to get you there. Anyway, that's all from that word miserable in verse 17 here. And poor and blind and naked. So God's not saying in this verse, like, I'm going to take all these things away from you and we'll see how much you suffer. He's saying it's actually already like this in your life. You just don't realize it yet. And by my grace and mercy, I'm insulating you from all these things that are right there, at least in terms of your awareness, so that you can have a space to prepare for that, so that you don't have to suffer as much as you would if I just sort of broke open the floodgates. It would be overwhelming to you. So he says, I counsel thee to buy of me gold tried in the fire, that you may be rich, and white raiment, etc. He's saying, come to me, I have these higher principles. And when I give them to you, you'll see. You'll have a greater awareness. You'll see how all this works, and you'll be able to overcome all of this and experience great joy in spite of it all. But the path is for him to correct us, for him to give us things that we don't have, to replace the things that we think we have with better things, and to give us additional things over what we have. And I'm not talking about objects. I'm talking about principles, ways of thinking, skill sets, strength. Okay, so when it comes to your character, one way to think about it is with a star chart. And you may never have seen one of these things before, but basically each one of these lines, it starts from the center, and the length of the line is the degree of whatever it is that we're measuring. And the angles of the line don't really matter in this case. It's just these are different properties. So your character is multidimensional, but here I've drawn 7 lines to kind of just give an idea of what this might be. And so some of these lines are really long, and those are things that you're really good at. And some of these lines are really short, and these are qualities in which you're deficient. And because we're talking about character, all of these things are positive, but you could also think about this in terms of negative attributes that you're trying to minimize. But in this case, we're talking about positive attributes that you're trying to maximize. So this graph right here, let's suppose that this is how you think you are. How you actually are. Now these chalky lines are how you think you are. So remember I said that the length of the line is the degree to which you've developed this attribute. So in this case, let's look at this line that goes from the center straight down. So how you actually are is short. So it means you're kind of deficient in this quality, but what you think is that you actually excel in this quality. And you can go around this and look at each spoke. And on two of them, it's pretty close, what you think versus what actually is. And in some cases, you think that you're much more advanced in the quality than you actually are. And in some cases, you think that you're much less developed in the quality than you actually are. So what are the consequences of this? So if you're spot on, that's great, right? But what if you think that you're much more developed in a certain area than you actually are? What's going to happen? Well, for one, you're going to resist opportunities to grow in that area because you're going to think that you're already there. That's bad. Two, you're probably going to push what you think onto other people in that category. And that's not good either, because what you think is kind of an illusion and you're wrong about it. Also, well, let's change gears. What about if you don't yet realize that you're really advanced in some quality? Well, there are a few consequences to that. One is you're not going to do great things in that category. Two is you're going to undervalue yourself in a general sense because you're not going to give yourself credit where credit's due. And maybe that's like the only thing you're good at and you don't realize it. And maybe it's a really big deal, but you're never going to get anywhere with that. But I think the number one deficit there, in the case where your actual quality exceeds what you think it is that you're not going to go out and bless other people with this gift that you have. Now, the extreme case of this is actually the line to the right, the horizontal line to the right, where you have this huge gift and you have no clue that you have it at all. And that's a really unfortunate case, and I see this frequently. So all of these things happen. You see it every day if your eyes are open to it. Now, there's another line we could plot, and I'm sorry this is getting kind of crowded, and that is your potential. And this has consequences as well. So in some cases, you have an enormous potential, and it's not realized at all yet. And depending on what you perceive to be your actual qualities, and depending on what your actual qualities are in reality, this will have different consequences, right? So let's look at the line that starts at the origin and goes straight down. So again, to remind you what the legend is, what each of these lines mean, the shortest one there is where you really are. The chalky line is where you think you are, so that's a problem. And then the green line's what your potential is. So in this case, you think you're way ahead of where you actually are, but your potential is even more than that. And in this specific case, you are never going to get there, not until you realize where you actually are. That's the first step. So going back to that Revelation 3 passage, the people that God loves, he corrects. And the reason he does this is because he's trying to get you to achieve your potential, because the desires you have inside of you, in many cases, will only be fulfilled through God teaching you the things that you lack to achieve your potential. In other words, you can't reach up and grab that star until you become who you could become. So, how do you see more clearly what you have? How can you get a more accurate estimation of who you really are right now? Because that is key to you progressing and living the life that is ordained for you. Well, first, you shouldn't presume. We assume so much about who we are. We shouldn't do that. We should let reality reveal it to us. And it does. As you acquire more and more wisdom, you also acquire a lot of sorrow, because you'll look around and see these people who are struggling with things that just should be so abundantly obvious to them. But they don't trust God, and they're overconfident in their abilities, and they presume way too much. The other thing is we shouldn't imagine. There's this phrase in the scriptures, vain imaginations. And this presentation is already too long, so I'll leave it at that. But it's possible to imagine what we're like. We shouldn't assume. We shouldn't imagine. We should let reality reveal it to us, and it will. So let's go back to money, because this is simple. Everyone understands it. It certainly isn't what's most important in life, but it's easy to measure and it's easy to think about. So if you're always struggling with money, maybe you should think about why that is. And there's probably a principle here that you're lacking. And until you address it, it's going to be like that shark on the hamster wheel. Probably not going to hear that analogy anywhere else. Anyway, every time you go around the wheel, you're going to get bit by this shark. So why don't you deal with that shark? What is the shark? How do you overcome that? And until you do that and you think about your life in an intentional way and address those deficits, they're going to keep getting you every single time. Let reality reveal it to you. I'm anonymizing this story. Okay, so suppose there's a person who finds that everyone they care about seriously ends up doing this completely unexpected thing and offending them in some major way. If that's the case with every single person you get close to in life, there's a common denominator here, and it's you. So that's an example of reality showing you something you lack, which it turns out that there's some massively bad thing in your character where you keep doing this to yourself and sabotaging these relationships. And you should uncover what the real problem is. Maybe the real problem is that you have these serious flaws in your character, and anytime you get close enough to somebody for them to realize this and point it out to you, you immediately run away from them. Because you're like a cockroach and you run into the dark when the lights come on. It's John chapter 3 again. Know what your limits are. Reality will reveal this to you. Okay, let's think about this in a strictly spiritual sense, but again, all of these principles are as temporal as they are spiritual. So suppose you're the kind of person that goes around saying, "Oh, I've received the gift of tongues. Oh, I've been ordained to the priesthood. Oh, I've had this spiritual experience. I've been baptized. I've been baptized with fire." Doesn't matter what the thing is, but you have these credentials. And you tout out these credentials every time a person or life shows you what your limitations are. You say, "Yeah, but I'm special because." As long as you do that, you're going to cut yourself off from the growth that God has ordained for you to experience. Going back to that desire graph, you're saying stop, or you're getting on that hamster wheel. And you're going to get hit by this same thing that you lack over and over and over again. Another example is people say, "Well, I've been saved." So what? Do you really have everything that God wants to give you just because you're quote unquote saved? Who cares? Keep going. What do you lack? It's not about what you think you have, it's about what you lack. This is where we started with the definition of humility, remember? It's an accurate understanding of what you don't have. So here are some tools that can help you expose this. Is there anything that you read about in the scriptures that you have not yet experienced? If so, those are things that you lack. Is there anything in the scriptures that you can't explain? So if the answer is no, then I would like to meet you because you have a lot to teach me. Chances are there's a very long list of things in the scriptures that either don't make sense to you, or if you're really clever, you can hide that and say, "No, it makes sense." But then the test is, what would you do in whatever situation in the future? Because if you can't perfectly predict the future, you don't yet know God. That was probably a bombshell, but it's true. Think about it. If you really want to grow, the way you're going to do that is to increase your trust in God. You have to honestly believe and live according to the belief that His ways are higher than your ways, that His ability to see reality exceeds yours. So one way to peel back the edges here and progress is to use the unknowns to learn more. What do I mean by that? Again, this is a long presentation. If you want to pause, come back to it, re-listen to parts, that's a really good idea. I seriously doubt you're going to extract everything you can from going through this once. So what do I mean by using the known unknowns to learn more? So you've got different kinds of unknowns. There are unknown unknowns, and those, forget about it, you've got no clue. But there are also these known unknowns. What's a known unknown? It's something you know that you lack. So there's a huge sea of things that you lack that you have no clue about. But we're not talking about those. You can't get traction there. It's the ones where you have a little handle to grab these unknowns because you know that you lack them. So recognize situations where you lack understanding. Are there consequences that you can't explain? So can you look at your life and explain why things are the way they are? If there are things that you can't explain, that's an opportunity to learn. Going back to the scriptures, can you explain why God did everything that he did, when he did, and why he did it? If you can't, then those are opportunities to learn. And again, don't fool yourself into thinking, no, I get this. Test yourself, test the accuracy of your model by predicting the future, and then see if it comes to pass. If you're wrong, then that's an opportunity to learn, because God wouldn't be wrong in his prediction of the future. One note of caution, I talk sometimes about trivia. So if you think about like the exam questions you get at religious institutions, they're absolutely ridiculous things that no one should care about ever. It's like, how many times was Paul shipwrecked? This is trivia, right? Or, what do you know about this one tenet of faith? Who cares, right? Everything we search for in the gospel should be directly connected to how we think, how we feel, how we act, how we will help others. If it's not connected to that, it doesn't matter. Now, the great thing about that is if you apply that filter, it turns out that everything in the scriptures is relevant in some way. But this really changes, it doesn't so much change what's there, it changes how we interact with what's there. And I know so many people, probably 50% of the emails I get are, hey, what do you know about this thing? Or have you ever thought about this? Or, if you've sent me one of those emails, I'm not saying that just because you use those phrases, you're on my naughty list about this stuff. What I'm saying is the space of things that people think about is cluttered with stuff that doesn't freaking matter, okay? Focus on what you're doing, what you're not doing, how you think about things, how you react to things in respect to your relationship to God. If that's not getting better and you're not coming to know him more than you do, you're absolutely wasting your time in what you're choosing to spend it on. Keep the rubber on the road and don't lie to yourself. Okay, as an example of this, let's say we're reading through the scriptures and we get to that part where the 70 return and one of Jesus' disciples says, hey, this guy has this demon and I can't cast it out. So here's the question. For one, didn't Jesus tell that guy that he had authority to cast out demons? So why couldn't he? And then you read, Jesus gives him an answer and he says, that kind cometh not out except by prayer and fasting. So then, interestingly, Jesus proceeds to cast out that demon without praying and without fasting. So my question to you is, what the heck is going on here? There's an answer to this question, but you should go deeper. You should learn details. You should really ask yourself, what's going on here? And a good analogy for this is you can think you know a topic, and then when you try to teach it, you realize there are all these things that you didn't know. Half of that comes from the questions of your students, and they hit you with something that exposes a limitation to your understanding. That's what life will do to you as well. You don't actually have to teach to have this experience. You just have to live life intentionally with open eyes. And God will show you through reality the limits of your understanding. But if you're just kind of rolling through life with your eyes closed, bumping into things and just assuming that's the way it is, you'll never get there. All right, so in Job chapter 38, we get this monologue from the Lord, and it is fantastic. And a lot of the language is kind of archaic, but the point is he's going through all these things that he knows about, and he's saying it he's relating these things in terms that Job can understand, and that might be external to what we can understand in some ways, but in other ways it's clear, and in general, the takeaway should be clear, which is that God knows so much more than we know. You could read this in Job 38. I think for time I'm going to skip it, but it's very clear as you read through this that we just have absolutely no clue what's going on. We are fools before God. In D&C 52, there's an interesting passage that reminds us how critical it is for us to have a contrite spirit, or an assumption that God knows so much more than we do. And not just lip service, but to actually deep down believe this. It says, he says, again, I will give unto you a pattern in all things, that ye may not be deceived. So what's the pattern? He explains it by giving examples. He says, wherefore he that prayeth, whose spirit is contrite, the same is accepted of me, if he obey mine ordinances. He that speaketh, whose spirit is contrite, whose language is meek and edifieth, the same is of God, if he obey mine ordinances. And again, he that trembleth under my power shall be made strong, and shall bring forth fruits of praise and wisdom, according to the revelations and the truths which I have given you. And again, he that is overcome and bringeth not forth fruits, even according to this pattern, is not of me. Wherefore by this pattern ye shall know the spirits in all cases under the whole heavens. There's a lot to this passage, and I'm just going to briefly focus on some things. But the idea here is that this pattern is humility. It's contrition before God. It's trembling under his power, and having all actions derive from that relationship with God. It's very important to recognize that we are at an enormous deficit when it comes to comparing our understanding with God. We're very far behind. When you have this attitude, you will act differently. This passage is from Nehemiah 9, and he's offering a prayer to God, and he's incredibly honest about things as they really are. And you should read this. I'll skip over it for now for time, but you can see the depth of humility in this passage, and he accurately recounts all the limitations of his people. And this is interesting because this prayer, he's asking for something, but he starts by listing out all the reasons why they're not worthy of getting what they want and what they're about to ask for. So he recognizes that this path is very important, and it has to come from God. And on this path, there are things that we might not want to face, but the only way to get to the end of the path is to turn right into the darkness and to ask God to shed light on all the things that we don't really want to see. You have to be extremely sincere and earnest. For example, if you feel really uncomfortable with compliments, one reason that might be is that you might be lying to yourself about who you really are. And you might have an inflated ego. So when people echo your representation of yourself, it makes you feel super uncomfortable because you're capable of lying to yourself, but you don't feel so good when other people lie to you because you haven't trained yourself to be deceitful in that respect yet. Another way is maybe you deflate your ego. So you have a character trait in which you're more advanced than your self-image suggests. And in that case, you're going to be overwhelmed by despair because God has given you these tools to attack life and you've buried them, and now you're exposed to these challenges that you have the power to overcome, but you choose not to. The truth is that you really are nothing. So that is true, but in God you can be everything. So if you choose to overstate who you really are, you'll be unprepared to contend with reality. If you choose to understate who you really are, you will also be unprepared to contend with reality. The key to being able to contend with reality is to seek God with all your heart, might, mind, and strength, and to realize that He will give you everything you need to contend with reality. With God, all things are possible. And as you turn to God, He will expose the areas in which you lack, and He will also give you all the tools to make those weaknesses strengths. These are truths. His strength is made perfect in weakness. That's a phrase from Paul. And the way it's made perfect in weakness is when we're honest about those weaknesses that reality will reveal to us, we will turn to God, and He will teach us the principles we lack so that our knowledge can empower us to overcome those weaknesses, and they'll actually be made strengths. So as we're conducting an honest inventory of where we stand, we should think about, first and foremost, in what do we still sin? If we still sin in anything, we're still in an elementary phase of the gospel, and it's time to really believe God and really repent. And that is possible. It's also required. As we progress from that elementary state, here are some advanced questions we can ask, which are equally important, but they rely on that foundation. What do you fear? Anything you fear is an opportunity for God to teach you, because there is no fear in faith. Perfect love overcometh all fear. And that's the love that God has for us. If you truly believe that God loves you, then you can't really fear anything, because you trust that everything that you will face as you're perfectly obedient to Him is for your good, and it's given to you from a God with perfect knowledge and with all power. And so it's impossible to fear anything. And maybe that sounds like a ridiculous statement, but I promise you that it is possible. It is possible to live without fear of anything. Next question, what wouldn't God ask you to do? If you have an answer to this question, then that is an area that you can learn to trust God more. What can't you do? This is a very interesting one. If you read through the scriptures and you see all these things and you say, well, I can't do that. I've never done this. I don't believe that I could do that. We have to come to the point where we sincerely possess the attitude that Nephi had. And he said, if God commanded me to do all things, I could do them. You have to honestly believe that. What can't you explain? If there's anything in the scriptures that doesn't make total sense to you, that's an area that you can seek God and learn. What overwhelms you? This isn't exactly the same as fear, but think about God for a second and think about His awareness. So you might get overwhelmed when life causes you to spin a few more plates than you're used to in the air at the same time. But think about how many plates God is spinning, because He's got all of His own plates, which I would suspect is more plates than any individual has. And He's perfectly aware of everyone else's plates, which in effect He is also spinning. Next question, what hurts you? If anything has the potential to hurt you beyond sorrowing for other people's sins, then those are areas that you can grow in. The sorrowing for other people, that never goes away, it just keeps growing. Next question, what are you doing that detracts from your ultimate potential, desires, and goals? It's a really good question to meditate on and take copious notes, because God will teach you. Anything that detracts from your potential, desires, and goals is something that you should minimize in your life and maybe eradicate. And the flip side of that question, the inverse of it, what are you not doing to achieve your ultimate potential, desires, and goals. And if you can do that, then you should. I already went over that and that. So every tradition constrains the options God has to give you something better than what you have. Think about that. He's got a whole bucket of things he wants to give you. And those might be principles, those might be outcomes, those might be situations. It doesn't matter. But he wants to give you these things because that would lead to an improved state over where you are right now. But he is constrained by several things that are your choices. One of those things are the traditions that you cling to, because while you hold any tradition, it constrains what he can give to you. It limits him. And so you have to let go of every tradition. And what's a tradition? A tradition is the assumption of terminality in a belief. That might be overly complicated, but the idea is it's a belief that you think is final. That's all a tradition is. And in the scriptures, the word tradition is usually preceded by the word false. We talk about false traditions. But in this definition that I've just given you, every tradition is either incomplete or incorrect. And a false tradition, I guess, would be an incorrect tradition. But incomplete traditions are also harmful in the same way. They are limited, and therefore they limit what God can give you. Anything that is limited will beget limitation. Traditions can only ever get you what those who hold those traditions have obtained. This is one way of measuring the limits of traditions. If someone holds a certain belief, well, let's do it this way. If you consider the set of people that hold a certain belief, and you analyze what they have in their life and what they don't have in their life, you will probably stumble onto or be able to enumerate the limits of those traditions. So we could go into great detail with cultures here or with certain segments of society, but you could probably think about that and get a lot of mileage out of this thought. So I invite you to explore that. Well, this is the last slide I've got for this set of ideas. I hope this is beneficial, and I encourage you to revisit parts of this. This is pretty long, but I think you'll get a lot of mileage out of exploring these things further.